Hello, friends, and welcome back to another edition of Project Stargate Friends Research. I'm your host, Mark Brenner.
I'm your co-host, Jake Malcolm.
And I'm your co-host, Vincent Moore.
And we are so glad that you are going to be with us today because we have a very, very exciting podcast today. Today on Project Stargate Friends Research, we have Parapsychology 101 with none other than parapsychologist Loyd Auerbach. I am so excited about this. We're going to learn a lot today, fellas. This is going to be an educational experience, and we're going to hear about some of the most fascinating tales that come from the world of the paranormal from one of the world's most renowned parapsychologists and articulate speakers. I was having a brief discussion, guys, the other day with Dr. Barry Taff, my colleague and friend from California, and he could not. He spoke very, very highly of him. He said he was a very articulate speaker and one in a brilliant mind. And I'm just real excited, man.
Yeah, he pretty much wrote the book on parapsychology. You could say this is really going to be an interesting show.
Yeah, I'm a member. You know how I'm a member. You guys know how I'm a member of the Rhine Research Center. He's one of the big dogs at the Rhine, or he was. We'll find out. But at any rate, this is going to be really exciting. I've always wanted to. I've seen them on. I remember you remember that show Sightings back in the 90s. Did y'all watch Sightings on Sci-Fi Channel back in the 90s?
Yeah, I remember that show.
Jake, you might have been in your daddy's balls at the time. Not sure.
Yeah, I might not have been around then.
Well, I'm ancient enough to where I remember that show. So,
it sucks being old sometimes, like us.
Also,
Jake's the baby here.
We did a lot more cooler things. Like we wore bikes without helmets and everything.
Yeah.
I never wore my helmet.
Yeah, these youngsters don't.
Jake, it's all right, Jake. It's all right, buddy. We love you. Anyway, man. Vincent, I can't overstate how excited that I am to have you back with us. We've really missed you, brother, and I hope your family's doing okay. I've been praying for y'all a lot. Definitely.
Thank you.
Yeah, but we're glad you're back, and we'll be bringing our guest on here in about 5 minutes or so. But anything, just real quick, give us something, Vince. What you been up to?
Well, I've been working, but one of the things I've been really fascinated about lately. I don't know if you've seen the pictures, but apparently they've taken a picture of the gigantic black hole at the center of our galaxy.
Wow.
A gigantic orange blob with a dark hole in the middle, like just a gigantic orange glowing donut. So they had launched a new telescope, the James Webb Telescope, and apparently it's going to do some fantastic things. So, when I have time to actually sit down, I've been, I have that one of those things in my feed on my phone that sends me news about that stuff all the time because I'm just a geek like that. So,
wow, that's cool. I'm looking forward to. I'm hoping that one day, maybe this fall or summer or sometime we can hit a dark zone. Maybe we can all go out and hit a dark zone.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. That'd be fun.
Yeah, that'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I've also I'm really, like I said, I'm really glad you got to be with us today. Greg, I don't think Greg's going to be able to make it with us today because he's working. He might be able to show up on the second segment or something. I don't know. But Greg, it's hard. Greg works on Mondays, so unfortunately, sometimes we have to schedule these interviews with whenever our guest is available. But wish Greg could be here with us. As far as I got a couple more minutes here, but I want to make a quick announcement. So we have I have a friend of mine. He's a priest. He's a Knights Templar. He's an exorcist. His name is Father Ron Patton. He's also a Navy veteran. He will be with us very soon. He's going to do several podcasts with us. We're going to talk about One of the angles that I want to cover on here, and Vince, me and you've discussed this quite a bit. We want to discuss some other angles of some of the paranormal and other subjects. Father Patton he's a great guy. I've been having some incredible discussions with this guy, and he's going to be joining us from time to time pretty soon. Also, we're going to be doing a roundtable podcast with Joe Jordan. He'll be coming back, and Father Patton will be with us on that one as well. We're going to have a roundtable podcast on the possible diabolical connection to UFOs. We're going to talk about that, and I think it's an angle that needs to be looked at. I want to look at all angles of this mystery, so we're all excited about that. But without further ado, I believe it is about time to bring our guest on. I'm going to work on bringing him on right now. Let's see. All right. Bring him on real quick. All right. Hang on, bear with me just a minute.
You're good.
All right. All right. Let's see. I think he's coming. Yep, he is dialing him.
Mark, just real fast. I don't know if you got this notification across the top of your screen if you subscribe to
there we go.
The same news as I do, but I just got a notification that said Pentagon holds its first UFO press briefing in half a decade. Is that?
Yeah, we're gonna get into that here in just a minute. We just got our Loyd Auerbach. Thank you, sir, so much for being with us on Project Stargate.
Are we doing video or just audio?
Video.
Okay. Well, let me turn that on then. Okay.
All right.
You're here today with my two co-hosts, Jake Malcolm and Vincent Moore, and we're really thrilled to have you today.
Thanks.
Awesome. So, Loyd, I'd like to start with this. This is kind of for one of the purposes of this interview is we want to learn about all the other aspects of parapsychology and maybe some cases you've investigated that tie in with these aspects. And can you give us a little bit of background as to how you got involved in this scientific field of study and the other things you do in the background, like being a mentalist and a psychic entertainer?
Where do you want to start? I mean, I think you need to direct this a little bit. Otherwise, it's kind of all over the map.
Let's start with just parapsychology. Maybe we'll get into the other stuff in the second segment if you want to.
Okay. So parapsychology, essentially, it's a form of consciousness studies. We're studying phenomena, abilities, experiences of consciousness that fall outside the range of what people would call normal. But essentially, excuse me, 1 second, sorry. But they really involve information transfer without the use of the normal senses or logical inference. We call that extrasensory perception. It involves mind over matter or mind-matter interaction, what's called psychokinesis, the idea that our minds or consciousness can directly affect matter and energy outside our body, but also inside our bodies. And we cover survival of bodily death, the idea that consciousness can survive the death of the body and still, or be outside the death of the body itself, and still connect or communicate, interact with the world around us, the physical world. So that's what parapsychology in a nutshell covers. There are breakdowns within that. ESP has real-time ESP, which we call clairvoyance. We have precognition, knowing before. We have telepathy, awareness of other people, what's in people's minds or emotions. And psychokinesis can break down into a lot of different effects, the ways everything from psychic healing to metal bending to moving objects to affecting devices. And then survival includes things like children who remember previous lives, so reincarnation research. My area, which is apparitions, the idea that people are sticking around as ghosts, but also we include in that mediumship studies, as well as out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, a variety of things. So there's the key is that we're focusing on what the human mind, human consciousness does. We don't really consider or have time or energy or even personnel to study the things that might be at the other end of our perceptions.
Wow. You know, when I years ago, I started researching various different types of paranormal subjects 18 years ago, and I remember in our discussion, our brief conversation today, I kind of gave you a little background on myself as to why I did. But I started out researching just little things like certain individual subjects like UFOs and ghosts and stuff like that, because I was trying to understand why I had this poltergeist event when I was 12 years old, why I had missing time when I was 13, these different things. And then all that led to parapsychology in one way or another. It just kind of drew me into it. What drew you into parapsychology? How did you get into that?
Well, I can point to a couple of things. First of all, I had a TV set in my room when I was 2. My dad worked for NBC. And I have family in television even to this day. So I grew up in the TV industry, but between television and some of the shows that were on when I was a little kid, which included One Step Beyond and Topper, which was a great ghost show. I have a lot of episodes of that on DVD. That was how I was exposed to some of this stuff. But then it was comic books and science fiction that I really got into. At the same time, so I started to read when I was probably 4. My mom was a preschool teacher and taught us how to read early. And I started reading comic books. I started reading kind of science fiction-y stuff that was available for little kids. And some of that had to do with psychic powers. And I was also a little science geek. I was interested in astronomy and geology, astronomy, space science. My dad actually was involved in the news coverage of the Mercury and Gemini space shots.
Wow.
So I inherited a whole stack of photos of Mercury and Gemini, some that were put out by NASA to public relations and to media, as well as a book on how to cover the Mercury and Gemini space shots. I got that from my dad as well.
I am so jealous.
So I'll make you more jealous. I've had dinner with Gordon Cooper. Have met people at NASA through another channel as well.
Yeah, I met Story Musgrave. He was really cool.
Yeah, there was a lot of folks that my dad got to know, and I grew up around some of the news coverage people, like Edwin Newman I met a few times, and Roy Neal was kind of like an uncle, especially later in his life. But throughout my childhood, I was just interested in the idea that people could have superpowers because of comic books. And then I started watching Dark Shadows, and Dark Shadows was probably the first time I heard the word parapsychology, although I had read it in a comic book before. So
right.
I think maybe a Superman comic or something. So Dark Shadows sent me to the library because I was interested in folklore. One of the first things I learned to read were mythology stories. So I was looking for books on vampires and werewolves because they were kind of fun. And unfortunately for parapsychology, it's in the same section in the Dewey Decimal System as vampires and werewolves. So I discovered that there were science books on parapsychology by J.B. Rhine, J.G. Pratt, Gertrude Schmeidler, and I just was devouring those. And in high school, I was able to, a couple of my teachers were interested. We were able to start a parapsychology club in my high school outside of New York City. And then it turned out that one of my neighbors, who was a yoga teacher, one of her students was a researcher by the name of Montague Ullman, who did the initial dream telepathy work with Stanley Krippner. And she introduced me to Ullman. And he introduced me to Gertrude Schmeidler. I'm a teenager, and they were like talking to myself and my club. So I was really exposed to the research early on, as well as reading all this stuff from Hans Holzer and other people going there. And so my intention was actually to become a parapsychologist. And I just lucked into, timing-wise, a graduate program that had started a year before I started looking into it, and was able to get a master's in parapsychology. Unfortunately, the program didn't last long enough for a lot of people to graduate, but that's how I got into the field.
Lucky you. Once again, lucky you.
I had a lot of those lucky, bizarre coincidences. So I think the universe was pushing me in this direction.
You think it's synchronicity? You think? Do you believe in coincidences for real? Do you believe in them?
Well,
or do you think it's all synchronicity?
Coincidence is a tough thing, because coincidence means that we are in our minds coinciding two events. And so that's a human meaning thing. Synchronicity seems to be a pattern of those things that seem to be more meaningful and can be judged, connected even by other people. We don't it's a hard thing to study. You can't really do it in the laboratory. That's one of the problems here, is
Right.
that I love it when skeptics say, "Oh, that's just a coincidence." It's like, yeah, we have laboratory research for ESP. You do not have laboratory research for coincidence.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know,
Let's jump into these aspects of parapsychology, and maybe you can give us a little something to chew on with maybe a case with each aspect. Well, I say let's start with clairvoyance and remote viewing. What do you say?
Well, remote viewing, which when it's real time, of course, is a form of clairvoyance. The key being, and I see a lot of misinformation out there because I see people supposedly teaching remote viewing. We're teaching people to see what's in an envelope in their hand, and there is, as my colleague Ed May would say, there is nothing remote about an envelope in your hand.
Right.
So remote viewing is, or remote perception, because it's not always a visual. Sometimes people get feelings or smells and so on, is an ability, a form of clairvoyance or real-time ESP, unless it's precognitive remote viewing, which is looking into the future, where you're given a target and you're asked to say what's there. And you, no matter how far away it is, I mean, it could be on the other side of the planet for that matter. I mean, typically it's going to be a couple miles away to make it remote, but it could be a few blocks. A lot of the viewers who have done this do get visuals, but they sometimes do get verbals, and they sometimes hear the sounds and pick up smells and how busy things are. It is a sort of trainable thing. One of the problems with psychic ability in general is that, like with artistic talent and musical talent, we seem to individually have aptitudes for certain applications of ESP and psychokinesis, and even survival related stuff. So meaning I might be able to do remote viewing, but if you asked me to say what was in the envelope, I couldn't do it. Or I couldn't do any precognition, but I can do some telepathy type of thing. I might be able to hold an object and get information about it. That's called psychometry, but not do remote viewing or anything else for that matter psychically. So there are different applications that people seem to have aptitudes for, which could be, belief-based, but there also seem to be some realistic levels. So with remote viewing, for example, how good somebody can get might also depend on the individual. Joe McMoneagle, the #1 viewer for the Stargate program, who I know, and actually is co-author of a book I wrote. I'm the 4th author, called ESP Wars East and West, about the US government program and the Soviet/Russian programs. Joe had mentioned that he got as good as he possibly could. He hit the ceiling. So he was amazing, but there's always room for improvement. He just couldn't get there any beyond that, because he hit the level of his aptitude for it. That's what we've actually seen. When they initially were looking for viewers, my understanding from Ed May is they went through literally over 1,000 possible subjects who could
Pat
do
Price.
It was a huge number. It was a huge number initially. And they cut it down to 60, and they put him through an actual workshop with Ingo Swann, and they got it down to 6. That's how many people came out of the initial training, the initial work. So, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of people to run through, but that's the 6 people seem to be good, have great aptitude for remote viewing. There were others that came later on. One of the problems with that program, however, is that there are a lot of people out there who were attached to the program for a very short amount of time because it looked like they could do remote viewing, but they didn't do very well, so they washed out of the program. They basically left the program. But because they were connected to the program, even for 3 months, suddenly they're the experts on the subject.
Wow. And Pat Price, I mentioned Pat Price. He was heavily involved after he retired as a detective. Well, he was a detective, right?
He was a police commissioner, actually.
Oh.
So he was a detective. He was a police commissioner. Now, so one of the things that's really interesting about the start of the remote viewing program is that people in parapsychology knew that remote viewing research was being done by Targ and Puthoff. It's just, so there was think of it as 2 parallel programs. The same people were doing research, not always the same viewers, although Pat Price did do work for both the government program or the secret program and the public program. The researchers were able to report on their research on remote viewing, specifically with viewers who were doing targets that were not classified or they weren't being asked to do those targets, let's say by the CIA or Defense Department. So throughout the entire program, we knew who the researchers were with remote viewing. We didn't always know who the viewers were from the Army project, but we all, in our field, we knew who the researchers were. In fact, I visited Ed May when he was working at SRI and doing that research. It's just that, you know, as far as I knew, there was not a secret government program happening at that time.
Right on. You know, it was probably, I don't know, 5 months ago. I bought, and I know this is child's play to a lot of parapsychologists, but I bought a deck of Zener, and I believe, you know, it has 25 cards in the deck.
Right.
And my wife, she has demonstrated, I believe, you know, I'll get into more of this later if you like. I believe my wife may be an agent of some kind. I'm not 100% sure, but I tested my wife. I did out of 10 consecutive tests with the Zener deck. She consistently scored between 14 and 24 on that Zener deck. I mean, consistently. And most of the ones she didn't get right, it was almost like it was precognitive. Like she was getting it was going to be the next one, the one that she guessed. It was actually the next one on the list sometimes. So,
you know,
what do you think of that?
In the testing that J.B. Ryan did, he found that there were some subjects who were not doing very well, except that they were guessing the next card that was going to be coming up rather than the asked for. We call, you know, that's called a displacement effect, and sometimes it was 2 ahead, not just 1 ahead. So that does happen with some people where precognition is more relevant than the real-time stuff.
Wow, and I was just blown away. Like I would just sit there.
That's a really amazing. Honestly, that's a really amazing hit rate.
Yeah. And we did it two ways. The first several tests, I would hold the card, and then she would. I tried to use some of the scientific method as much as possible. Yeah, I'm not a scientist. I'm just a regular Joe, but and I try to use my common sense here. And I try different methods. I would just hold the card facing me, of course. Sometimes I would hold the card. She'd close her eyes. Sometimes that she would hold the card and pull it off the deck, and she would close her eyes, but hold the card facing me, and I was astounded how accurate my wife was.
She ought to try some of the online experiments that are out there.
I'm sure she'd be willing to. I'll have to talk. I'll talk to you about that sometime. Maybe we can arrange something, because my wife, I'm telling you, she's very empathic. Also, I think she might be multidisciplinary, and also, I do have some reason to believe that she might be a PK agent. I do have with her epilepsy.
Right.
And some things we've talked about.
We're communicating about that. Yeah.
Speaking of PK, let's just jump into PK right now. PK is another really, really fascinating subject, and I want to go through a few more of these aspects, maybe talk about a few cases you've investigated, and towards the end of this first segment, maybe we can get some Q&A with Vincent and Jake. Let's talk about PK. What is PK?
So psychokinesis, you know, most people would think of telekinesis, the idea that, you know, somebody concentrates hard and things start levitating or moving. But psychokinesis is the broader category. It means motion or action by the mind, because that's what we're really talking about. Telekinesis means remote action. And actually, when I use my remote control on my TV, that's telekinesis.
It is.
Yeah, or control car, that's telekinesis. So we don't like to use that term for that reason. You know, we're talking to the public sometimes about that specific case type of thing. That's fine. But PK, it covers a really wide range, because we're not exactly sure always where the effect is actually happening. So even for something like metal bending or psychic healing, for example. So either, you know, those are kind of parts of the spectrum of psychokinesis. For metal bending, there have been metallurgical analyses of some of the spoons from the spoon bending parties and other things that seem to have either bent way too easily or bent into shapes where they should have been broken, snapped. Maybe the metal itself was a brittle metal, like a hacksaw blade or something like that, or the metal flopped over on its own. And there's a difference. The metallurgical studies were done in the early 1980s, and there was a big difference looking just simply under a microscope between what happens when you physically force a bend versus these things flopping over on themselves, as if parts of the grains of metal actually melted into each other, versus fracturing and pressure points that are happening. So that's one thing that was really interesting. I've run a bunch of spoon bending parties over the until the pandemic. I'm hoping to do them again. And it's pretty amazing to see what actually happens. And it's pretty clear when you're watching and you're not really part of it, you're kind of directing things. It's clear when people are putting pressure on. You can see that. You can see that in their hands.
Right.
And then you have things that just get bent into the most bizarre shapes or seem to be beyond their ability. I often buy really cheap spoons at like dollar stores. And I played with, the reason I did that is I started playing with those kinds of spoons. And like plastic spoons, they snap if you bend them too quickly. So to see someone quickly bend something into a spiral, and then actually we had someone who was able to unbend them, which was really bizarre. But she actually asked that. She said, "Can I unbend those things?" And she took these spoons that were cheap, that would normally break when you bent them. To unbend them, there was just no way to do that without breaking them. And yet she was able to straighten them out. I've seen folks bend things, these 1-inch thick aluminum rod or very, very heavy spoons or other utensils, and even done it myself over the years. And it's a really peculiar feeling when you're doing it. And you kind of know, if you're a researcher and you lean into this field, you start recognizing the sensation, which is no sensation. It's really interesting. It's not about concentration. It's not about that vein throbbing on your head. It's about letting go of perceptions and beliefs, which is one of the reasons why the spoon bending parties work. It's because we're trying to get people to act really goofy spoons, and that overcomes a lot of the issues of the psychology of psychokinesis.
What's happening in the environment? We can take measurements of changes in the environment. What's happening in the environment from what you've observed, and even, maybe even biologically, if there's something going on? What's going on when something flies off the table, flies off the wall, a spoon's bending? What's going on? What have you observed in the local area environment?
Well, first of all, I have to say that with the things flying around, like in poltergeist cases, we can't do a whole lot because in terms of measurement, we can measure the environment, hoping that something's going to happen, but then something has to happen. And those things are typically very spontaneous and unconscious. The folks who've been able to do PK on a regular basis, I work with a guy named Martin Caden, who was connected to NASA, as it happens. He was a consultant to NASA, and Marty was, among other things, an incredible science and science fiction writer. He wrote the book Cyborg, which became the $6 Million Man. I wrote a book called Maroon, which was an Academy Award-winning film with Gregory Peck in the 60s, which predicted the Apollo 13 event.
Excuse me.
And actually, he was someone who could move objects under very controlled conditions. Before I even worked with him, he had people from NASA and other organizations that had actually done some work with him under controlled conditions. He couldn't move big things, but environmentally, it was really interesting. We call PK the trickster phenomena because if there's 5 ways for something to move, like in his case, he was moving these small targets that were spinning on spindles. They could be enclosed in an airtight bell jar. You could wait and watch and see nothing happen. And you could do all sorts of measurements. So sometimes we saw that the temperature inside the bell jar did raise by 1 or 2 degrees, which really wasn't enough to cause microcurrents of air, but it still raised. The next time we tried measuring that, we're also measuring electrostatic fields. We see an electrostatic field, but no temperature change. And the next time we see nothing in our sensors at all.
I think I've heard Dr. Tapp talk about that a few times in some of our private conversations. I think I've heard him mention that before.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. And then we don't know. Marty did do some studies prior to working with me with some folks who did take a look at some things around his brain. One of the things they were doing is to see whether or not he was giving off biophotons in an increased manner. Our brains do give off photons. They're called biophotons, usually in an order of 1 to 3 per second, which is not very much. In fact, it's not visible. I mean, even you can in a completely darkened room, 1 million biophotons is not visible, typically. And in fact, we are doing research. John Kruth, who's the executive director and research director at the Rhine Research Center in Durham, North Carolina, is doing biophoton research and has worked with healers and martial artists who have been able to go from that 1 to 3 or 1 to 5 biophotons per second to over 500,000 per second to even up to 1 million per second. Again, not visible, but detectable in a complete and darkened room with a particular type of equipment. So there can be some physical things that can be measured. It's just that the way we think of them, they're not observable, and you have to be in certain conditions to measure them.
You did a great job explaining that. Just imagine, gentlemen, if we could harness this ability for other things. What if we had like a device in our home and we had a couple cables connected to it and our home was just powered indefinitely? What if we had like a little ship that could...
Let me stop you for a second, because one of the interesting things about PK is equipment or appliances working without being plugged in.
Right.
So exactly what you're talking about.
Exactly. But if we could discover what type of energy is actually driving PK, I think I should have reformulated that. I mean, it would change everything. It seems like it would change I think it would change the trajectory of mankind.
One of the problems with psychokinesis in general, though, I mean, there's certain aspects of PK that are acceptable. Like for many people, healing is acceptable. And in fact, the placebo effect itself is a form of psychokinesis. The medical community may not want to admit that. But, remember, we balance a lot of our pharmaceutical research against the placebo effect.
Right.
And when you think about that, sometimes people feeling better because the sugar pill they were told was medicine is one thing. But when there's an actual change in the body, which does happen, and medical science has seen that with placebo, that is psychokinesis, when I'm affecting my own body, positively or negatively. Negatively, it's called a nocebo effect, and we know about that one. Positively, it's the placebo effect. That's PK.
That's fascinating, man. Give us a little something here, if you don't mind, Mr. Auerbach. Give us a case give us one of the most remarkable cases you're able to talk about as far as like a poltergeist goes. Can you do that?
Sure. I can give you a couple of cases. One was remarkable. Remarkable to you may not be remarkable to me. So I'll just give you a couple of key cases, just kind of like to say that.
Cool.
I had a case years ago. I had a couple cases in the mid 80s. We actually, because when we had a graduate parapsychology program, we were getting a lot more cases at that time. But we had a case where a couple had their son was at the center of a really interesting poltergeist situation where there were bursts of water that were appearing right below the ceiling and kind of splattering in all directions.
Are you talking about the Rain Boy in Pennsylvania?
No, I am talking about a kid here in the Bay Area in San Leandro, California.
Okay.
So, yeah, this was a case. I've had other cases of water. This was a case where the parents had done everything possible to determine a normal explanation for it. In fact, one of the things that the father had thought was maybe the pipes are leaking, so they had plumbers come in. Maybe there's a condensation effect. So they actually had our local utilities company, Pacific Gas and Electric, come in. And while the guy was there were 5 bursts of water that he observed with everybody else.
Wow.
And he was the one who actually said, I think you need a different kind of expert. And he kind of pushed them towards JFK University. It was interesting. It was pretty clear to them that it was their 12-year-old son who was at the center of this, however, because he was always present, even though the bursts of water were far away and no one was near them, for example, down the hall. And sometimes they often were observed happening when he was at, for example, the kitchen sink, and he'd be getting a drink of water and there'd be bursts in the living room. So it was connected to water in some way for him. So I got the call, and at the time, the couple and their 2 kids, their 2 boys, were at their next door neighbor's house. And I'm talking to the father, Don Pollard, and he's explaining all this. And I said, can I talk to your son? And then all of a sudden I hear in the guy, I guess another adult male voice saying, Don, it's happening here. And I heard some pops, very faint pops, and turned out that there were water bursts in the other house as well. So their son David gets on the phone with me, and I started talking to him. And one of the things we look for in poltergeist cases is what, right before the events happen, what changed in your life? I mean, for an adult, it might, did you lose your job? Or did you have a problem with the relationship? Did someone die in the family? Was there something that emotionally connect or stress related or emotion related is negative for you. And so I started talking to the kid about this. I said, what changed recently? You know, what have you been doing before this started? Was there anything went on at school? Because school's a big thing for kids. And he said, well, I used to do martial arts, which to me was a really good thing. He said, but I had to quit. I said, why'd you quit? He said, well, I don't like to compete. And as soon as they were teaching us and then suddenly they start competing against other schools, I didn't want to do that. So I quit. I said, did you tell your parents why you quit? No, I just told them I wasn't interested anymore. I said, well, what happened next? And he said, they wanted me to have an extracurricular and they knew I liked to swim. So they kind of pushed me to be on the swim team. And that's when things started happening.
So he hated swimming, in other words.
He loved swimming. He
loved it.
Competing. He hated competition.
Okay. I understand now where the emotional factor comes into play here now.
Yeah. So the water was representative of that swimming thing. As it happened, I knew a martial artist, kung fu teacher, who spent more time with his students on practice and also the philosophy of and the using chi and everything else. His school rarely ever competed at all, and his claim, as far as big thing he would tell students, is we don't have to compete if you don't want to. When we compete, however, we always win. So that was another, and which is true. I mean, they won they almost never competed, but they won every competition. So he started taking lessons from this other guy. And honestly, as soon as we brought the competition thing into the discussion, and the parents said, okay, you can quit the swim team, it stopped anyway. But the martial arts piece really helped a lot.
Wow.
Another case I had was a woman who came to us at JFK claiming she was an ex-cop, had been a cop in the Bay Area in San Francisco, had moved up to Alaska after she got divorced to get far away from that situation, left her son with her husband, came back after 10 years of being a cop up in Alaska, was in high-tech security with other ex-cops and ex-military people. And all of a sudden, she started talking about some shadowy figure that would grab her by the throat and choke her. And when she came in to see us, she had marks on her throat. She took off a scarf. She claimed to have other witnesses. The other witnesses who I spoke to who were actually her coworkers, did see one attack or the aftermath of the attack. They didn't see what she said they saw. They saw the bruises actually appearing on her throat. So when my colleague on the faculty and my colleague Sharon Frankmont was a psychologist, also very psychic. So she was a psychic as well. And we went out to her mom's place where she was living for the time being, had been there for 6 months or so. And she had an attack in front of us where she fell on the ground. I actually could see it about to start because I was looking right at her when she was freaking out. And she falls on the ground. Her hands never touch her throat. Her throat bulged out like a bullfrog's.
Ooh.
4 depressions on one side, 1 on the other. And she's squeaking out, get it off me, get it off me.
That's awful.
It is awful, but it was the weirdest thing. I had only been in California again for 2 years. I was still pretty much a New Yorker. So I started using some choice 4-letter words to tell it to get the F away from her. And it stopped. It was like really bizarre, honestly. And Sharon, who was incredibly good at picking up spirits, among other things, looked at me and shaking her head, no, there's no spirits, there's nothing. Sharon starts asking some questions about what was going on. We find out she started having nightmares about her father molesting her as a child. Her father had been dead for years. She was seeing a therapist, not telling the therapist about the attacks, about the nightmares. It was all interrelated. And the attacks typically happen when she started talking about her father, or either right before or right after she went to the therapist was when these things started happening. So this was actually a nocebo effect. This was her own mind doing a poltergeist effect on her own body.
It sounds like the Doris Spither case a little bit.
Yeah. A number of cases that Barry Taff and Carrie Gaynor had, and other cases some of my colleagues have had, where people have reported having attacks on themselves. One of my colleagues in the faculty in the 80s, Cynthia Siegel, had a whole bunch of cases in a row, which seemed to be around sexual or seemingly sexual stuff, but always happened only when the woman was in the bed. one case of a guy. And in looking into those cases psychologically, there were sexual issues between the couple, always.
I bet. It
So
makes sense. It makes a lot of sense what you just said.
Poltergeist phenomena is mostly tied to the person's psychology, to living people. But as I told you when we talked last week, in about 30% of the cases, and Barry Taft's cases, he's had a bunch of cases like this, there's a neurological issue, either epilepsy or epileptiform activity in the brain. And one of the theories, or I should say hypotheses, is that the poltergeist activity is actually the seizure.
I agree with that, because you remember briefly in our conversation last week, I told you about an incident that happened with my wife when she was having a clonic-tonic or a grand mal type seizure. Myself and one other, possibly a second witness, saw her glasses have a mind of its own. Why? But this one thing I will note, Mr. Auerbach, is when this happened, she was kind of coming out of the seizure. She still was. Not all her dogs were barking yet. Some of them were still meowing. But she was sitting down on the couch. She was semi out of it. You could tell. And that's when it occurred. But we had other poltergeist stuff happen before that, and days before that, and a couple days afterwards.
The study that was done showed that for the most part, people didn't have PK, the poltergeist activity, while they were in the midst of a seizure. It's either when they were coming out of it, or they didn't have a seizure at all, that they kind of like froze up. It looked like they were about to have a seizure, but instead of having a seizure, all this activity happened outside their heads.
Exactly. And another thing I thought it'd be good to note, sir, my wife, she takes Klonopin to control her seizure. My wife can feel she's fixing to have one most of the time.
Yeah.
She can't put her finger on what's happening. She'll just take some clonazepam, and it's cool. Some people smoke weed. That quells seizures. And I heard those are two of the better things I've heard of actually for seizures. Some of these seizure medicines are horrible.
I've heard
horrible.
That. Yeah.
Like Keppra. Keppra is crazy. But anyway, I didn't mean to get off the beaten path. Let's just do some Q&A real quick. Jake, let's start with you.
Yeah, so before we go into any of that, I just want to point out something weird that just happened in that conversation. I have this lighter was sitting on my desk, and as we were talking, it did about a 180-degree spin sitting on my desk. Both my hands are in my lap.
Really?
I don't know what that's about. There's no breeze, no open windows, but I don't know. I just thought I should bring it it to attention.
It's not the first time we've had some weird stuff go down, Mr. Auerbach, during our podcast.
I think it boils down to when you're talking about a subject you're interested in, sometimes your brain will actually, or your mind will say, oh, you need to see this. Because that certainly happened to me over the years.
That's so cool, man. Right. You want to kick it off, Jake?
Yeah. So I've actually been taking some notes here. Mainly what I'm curious about, the spoon bending, because that is something I am a bit familiar with. When you're focusing on bending a spoon, or the subject is focusing on bending a spoon, are you focusing on bending at a certain point, or does it just happen randomly? Like, is this something where you actually have to focus on bending it to a 45 or all the way to a 90-degree angle, or it just kind of happens and it's
so one of the things that's really interesting about the spoon bending part, we call them parties because you do try to get that party atmosphere. It really does take you out of your own place. There's a psychology behind doing this that goes back to the 1960s. A guy named Kenneth Batcheldor came up with a couple of elements around psychokinesis. One is called witness inhibition. When people see someone bending a spoon outside of an entertainment context, or bending something or moving something, some people freak out. But then there's ownership resistance, which is the big thing. People have a problem accepting that they can do it. In the spoon bending parties, what we do is we blame it all on the spoon. So what's going on is you're not trying to bend the spoon in a particular way at all.
Okay.
In fact, the procedure, which was set up originally by a guy named Jack Houck, an aerospace engineer, starting in the late 70s, and we did a bunch of things with him at JFK University when I was a student and much later. It was you go with which, first of all, the spoon you're holding may not want to bend. So if it doesn't feel like it wants to bend, pick up a different spoon that feels like it might want to bend. And you kind of go with the direction that it feels the path of least resistance. That's really what happens. And that's why you get all sorts of different kinds of bends with the same exact type of spoons, or forks for that matter. In fact, let me grab something here. I'm going to reach behind. So here's one from one of my early spoon bending
Oh,
parties.
wow.
This is
wow.
a very heavy, thick fork.
Yeah.
And I can barely, I mean, if I put a lot of pressure on, I can sort of unbend it, but I have a whole bunch. I actually have boxes of spoons and forks from these parties. I'm trying to figure out what to do with them. People will take some souvenirs, but not every one that they bent.
I want to be just like this guy when I grow up. I swear,
No kidding, man. No kidding.
They're kind of fun. They're fun to work. It's really, and it's great for older kids are really good at this too. And you never know which direction something's going to bend. That's the thing, or if something's going to bend. I did a small group at a place where I was teaching courses a few years ago, and someone who was a researcher who had never done a spoon bending party before, we had some plastic spoons. He bent a plastic spoon.
And it didn't
without
break.
snapping. I mean, I can't even fathom that from any sort of normal explanation.
So
without heating it up first, melting it.
Sure. And that kind of leads into my next question, if I may. What, in your opinion, what do you think is causing the fusing of the metals that we've talked about?
Well, Jack Houck often called this process warm forming, because you'd find that sometimes the utensil would actually feel warm, not hot, but warm. And actually, if you get a spoon and you bend it, or any piece of metal, you bend it back and forth quite a bit, the friction of the grains is going to cause it to be hot, but not hot enough to actually melt the grain boundaries. That's the interesting thing. The melting point of aluminum is 1100 degrees, and people have bent aluminum rods. So there's no amount of friction the human body could produce, either bending or just simply rubbing it, that could cause enough heat for that to melt inside without burning the hell out of your hands.
Sure.
First. So we don't know exactly what's happening, but it seems that the process of bending needs a fluidity. People talk about the things that are easy to bend suddenly feeling like they're clay or plastic or Play-Doh or something like that just simply flops over or bends that way. So we don't know if it's a very localized molecular level heat or something else that's causing them to kind of change their structure.
We're getting towards the bottom of the hour. Those were some really good questions, Jake. Vince, I want to let you squeeze a couple of, I want you to squeeze in a couple of the questions yourself. I know you'll have some questions for him. Vince, why don't you take it from here as well?
Well, I was really perked up by when you were talking about martial artists. I studied jujitsu for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
One of my teachers was a Buddhist priest, and sometimes he would do things that I found absolutely remarkable. So, could you tell me in your, when you studied martial artists, what were the type of phenomenon, if any, and what is it about martial artists? Was that, you would hear stories about ki and a lot of different types of things that they talk about, but what were some of the things that you experienced when you studied martial artists?
So I've only worked with a couple of martial artists. We worked with one when I was in my first job at the American Society for Psychical Research, who actually ended up being the martial artist who taught the men who stare at goats. He was involved in that which was not a government sanctioned project. It was a group of guys in the Army who did that, who wanted to become real Jedi. And there were a number of things that he was able to do, which included influencing or throwing chi, as he would say, even through a wall to kind of influence someone to move in a particular direction. We did a study with that. He was able to actually break an infrared photoelectric cell, so infrared beam from across the room, just by doing that. Some of his students claim to have seen him, knock things over at a distance. There were a number of aspects of what were actually done by him that we were uncertain about. But one of the things he taught me, which was really an interesting thing to try, was to actually keep in mind that people around you are unconsciously psychic and pick things up. We actually, the ASPR where I was doing the research at that time, doing the work, is in the Upper West Side of New York. It actually doesn't really exist anymore as such, but it's just south of the Museum of Natural History. It's right off Central Park West. Very busy street, especially Columbus Avenue and Central Park West. And we went out on a very busy afternoon on a fall day, and he wanted to show me something. So he had me picture in my mind, this was bizarre to me. He said, picture in your mind that you have a submachine gun under your coat, and you're going to pull it out and shoot everybody, which is a bizarre thing to do. Now, of course, my facial expression at that point with people coming towards me might have been unconsciously picked up by people to step aside and clear the path, so to speak. However, he wanted to do this the other way around, and we would approach clumps of people who were in front of us, and as we got within a few feet of them, they would part and kind of close up behind us. So it was really interesting to see as an example of perception and what chi can do and how you can kind of focus your energy that way to try that. I work with I've done some research on martial artists. I haven't done much more work than that. There are a couple other people I worked with over the years. The research that I was mentioning before with martial artists is being done at the Rhine Center on the East Coast. I'm not directly involved in that research, but John Kruth has been working with them.
That's cool.
However, my dad was, as a sports producer for NBC, he did produce a number of the karate events for NBC back in the 70s. And at one point he showed me, interestingly enough, he showed me footage that they had at NBC, and apparently the other networks had it too, because apparently the skeptics had seen it. One of the skeptics made a big comment about it. This was a film shot at 1,000 frames per second of someone doing, basically breaking, it was either cement, I can't remember off the top of my head here, with a cement block or brick. And it showed it from the side where it was the hand approaching the brick, and you could see the actual stone breaking before the hand hit it.
Wow.
And the skeptical explanation was that he was moving his hand so fast, he created an air pressure wave. But there is no physical way that a human being can create that kind of air pressure wave, short of being the Flash. So
That's cool.
There have been a number of other circumstances. There's a lot of apocryphal stories about martial arts doing some pretty amazing things, some of which are tricks. There was a Magic magazine back in the late 70s that even had a martial artist actually wrote up a list of stunts you could do that look like you're breaking something with your hand, but really not. There were a whole bunch of things that were included in that. How to prepare a pine board so it breaks really easily, things like that. But it's just, there's definitely something energetic going on and something a little bit more than what we typically expect. Guy Savelli, the martial artist I work with, actually sent me some footage of kind of a demo of what he had done with some Army Special Forces guys, teaching them certain techniques, including a form of the dim mak, which is a kung fu delayed death blow, supposedly, and delayed death touch, and showing how just slapping a watermelon, these guys could slap a watermelon or an orange or something else, and they cut it open and it was pulped inside.
Yeah, Democ is really controversial depending on who you ask.
Yeah, I know. It is, honestly, during the whole process that he was working with those guys doing, the Earth First Battalion for the Men Who Stare at Goats, that should not have been the title of the book. Guy had sent me photographs of his demos and the results. He wasn't teaching them to stare at goats to kill them. He was teaching them the dim mak. And he actually sent me photos of an autopsy, kind of like cut open. The goat's innards were just pulped.
Wow, that's creepy,
So,
man.
it was really creepy. But when the movie came out, the book came out, it's like, don't they mean the men who touched the goats? Which would have been a terrible title for that book.
That would have been a really awful title, man.
Well, that might have, that might be the name of the porn version, I guess, of the book. I would have sold to a different audience at that point.
Dude, you're hysterical, man. You got a great personality for this work, man. I'm telling you.
Well, I learned a long time ago that not to take myself too seriously. Life's too short.
Why so serious? Yeah. Vince, you got something else? Are we good for now?
Yeah, I had one last question. So I, like you, I was really influenced by comic books. I especially collected the X-Men because I was always at puberty, somehow you'd be able to fly or something like that. I was hoping that would happen. But do you find that everybody has these types of, they have these abilities like PK or telepathy, but then some people, it just never manifests, or they just may not have the aptitude for it? Like, is it something like that? Is it something that everybody can do naturally, but some people just aren't able to manifest it, I guess?
There's some form of psychic ability that everybody can do. Everybody, as kids, we tend to be more psychic. We just get educated out of it. And culturally, we're told not to believe in it. With psychokinesis, it's a little tougher because it is a scary ability. I mean, much as those of us who are comic book fans would love to be able to do PK, it's still, from a societal perspective, would make you, there's a reason why all those movies say if you start doing this, the government's going to come after you. They're really not going to do that, but they're going to want to somebody's going to want to do some studies, figure out what makes you different than other people, including people in my field who don't want to do that. So everybody has an aptitude for something. We find that people can do unconscious PK more likely than anything conscious. And probably one of the more common PK effects that happens to almost everybody is when you're stressed out, some form of technology around you screws up. It's like a computer malfunctions, your printer doesn't work, your phone is going haywire. There's something wrong, something's screwed up until you calm down. While you're completely, especially during frustration. Of course, that becomes more frustrating, which reinforces the whole process.
That's incredible, man. Good question, Vince, man. I appreciate the good questions. We're coming up it's time for us to go to break. But when we come back, we're going to talk about telepathy, ghosts, near-death experiences, and anything else this amazing gentleman wants to speak of that's on his heart and mind. You're listening to Parapsychology 101 with Loyd Auerbach, and this is Project Stargate. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back to Project Stargate Friends Research. This is Parapsychology 101 with our special guest, parapsychologist Loyd Auerbach. Loyd, welcome back, sir, and welcome back, Jake and Vince. Jake, you had a question. There's another question we didn't get to earlier, and I apologize. We were kind of coming up hot on our first hour. But you had one further question also. Would you like to go ahead and kick that off, and then let's talk about telepathy.
Sure. And this might feed into that. And I did, I did not have this question poised at that point. But when it comes to biophotons, we touched about this, and this is the first I'm hearing of it. Could biophotons, the way some people can sense when someone's walking into a room, or when they're in a room and they're not alone, or perhaps you're in a gas station late at night, someone walks in, you get that gut feeling. Could that be biophotons and how it relates to other people around you and how they're projecting theirs?
It could be. There's been no mechanism that's been detected for that, but for humans to sense that sort of thing. But it tends to be, if you look into the psychic world, they talk about auras for people.
Sure. And that was actually going to be my next question, if that's related to aura
that's
and
not
chi.
biophotons. We think that that is a visualization of the electromagnetic field that everybody has.
Sure.
So, there's a couple of different things that we give off. We do give off an electromagnetic field, which can ebb and flow depending on our health and other things. And we also give off infrared energy. That's the heat of our body. So we think that what is happening with an aura, when somebody says they can see auras, is that they are picking up on, they have an electromagnetic sense, a magnetic sense. They're picking up on the field, but their brain translates that into a color, because there's no other way to see that. I mean, it's not a visual to begin with. That's one of the things that we know about perception, is that a lot of what we see or hear is not the full spectrum of the world. That's number one, even in the visible spectrum. So it's a matter of when you get psychic information and you see something like seeing a ghost, you're not seeing that ghost with your eyes. You're seeing that ghost with your perception. That's the end result of data coming in and your brain or mind making sense of that and adding it to the visual stuff. Now, it may be that biophotons are part of that, but we've been doing studies with remote staring since the early 90s. Everybody has had the experience of the sense of being stared at and knowing that somebody's staring at you. And in fact, the first research on this goes back to around 1915. There is an Army field manual that Martin Caden, who I mentioned earlier, he showed me, which actually had a little paragraph in it that said, for snipers, advice for snipers, do not stare at your target for more than 1 minute, because by the process of mental telepathy, that target will know that you're staring at them. So it's been recognized in all sorts of aspects. What is it about that? So is it telepathic, since we're going to start talking about telepathy, or is it actually just a sense of energy? I mean, we may just sense the energy of other people, and we can kind of sense other people's energy anyway. There are a lot of applications and even some experiments about that. For me, every once in a while I run into one of these so-called skeptics who, when you start talking about energy from the human body, or psychics talking about seeing energy around a body, I've actually seen and heard a couple of skeptics say, we don't give off energy. It's like, okay, dude, you must be dead, because at the very least we give off heat, which is energy,
Right. Very interesting.
Wow.
All right. Well, that pretty much answered basically the long and short of it. Could we be picking up on each other's biophotons?
It would be interesting. I don't know that we know if we have photoreceptors in our skin that would allow us to pick up 1 to 5 biophotons per second. We might. I mean, there's still a lot we don't know about the human body.
Right.
Yes, that is very true. That is very true. Telepathy.
Yeah.
How about
so, first of all, telepathy is not like in science fiction. It is not what Marvel Girl or Jean Grey can do.
Or Deanna Troi on Star Trek.
Or Deanna Troi. She's an empath. She doesn't do, but the other Beta Zeds can actually do telepathy, real telepathy. She's more of an empath in that sense, a psychic empath. But interestingly enough, the word when I hear people talking about the word poltergeist, a lot of ghost hunters use that term all the time, and they insist that because it means noisy ghost, that's what it translates to, that's the only definition for it. But the reality is, words change. Telepathy, when it was first introduced, telepathy means feeling emotion at a distance. It's not picking up actual verbal information, but we know that that's changed. That changed in the later part of the 19th century. And certainly science fiction made telepathy all about mind reading and back and forth kind of stuff. So what we seem to see with telepathy is that people can connect, people who are really emotionally connected do have sometimes mutual dreams. They pick up things from a distance. We all have kind of the experience of knowing who's on the phone. These days it's caller ID, but in previous iterations, we kind of knew who was calling us at that time. That may be precognition. It may not actually be telepathy. But there's an element to this that seems to be that people can pick up some people's surface thoughts, I would say.
Do you mind if I interject something really quick?
No, please.
I'm so sorry for interrupting, but I want to relate a quick experience to you that I've had along these lines, real quick. I told you a little bit about some of my past paranormal experiences. And I use the word paranormal as a blanket term for various phenomenon, just to get that out there. But one of the most vivid experiences I remember, I was probably about 4 or 5 years old, and I was staying at my grandparents' house in South Mississippi, and I woke up. I set up I was in a basement bedroom, and I woke up, and there were three entities standing at the foot of my bed. Uh, and they were very small. They were wearing these dark maroon colored robes, kind of like a druid cloak. They had something over their head. They were about 3.5 feet tall, I think. Big black almond shaped eyes. Very small nose. That's what I remember from the experience. But they gave these ideas started popping in my mind. They didn't speak any language. They did not speak to me verbally. They spoke to me. I believe they were using a form of telepathy. Because, and my question here is, would you consider what they're doing what they did to me and thousands of other testimonies that are very just like this, where these possible ETs or interdimensional entities, when they have these contact or abduction scenarios, it's almost like they're putting thoughts in a little simple command, very simple, direct commands like "come with us," or "don't be afraid," or don't hurt us, or something like that. What's your thought? Does that fall in line with what?
Well, if they exist at all, they may be communicating via telepathy. That may be an easy way. But along with that, when people communicate with an apparition, with a ghost, when mediums have communication with spirits, that's all telepathic. That's not, they can say, I can hear the voice of the ghost, but really you're not hearing it with your ears. You're getting telepathic information your brain is turning into an audio kind of experience. And that's not how everybody experiences it. Some people just experience it as this thought popped into my head from this guy who's standing over there, who's going to disappear in a second. So it's all telepathic anyway. It's all mind-to-mind communication in that sense. And then we also have people on occasion who we have built up defenses. I mean, we have things that allow us to block the thoughts of people around us. Otherwise, we would go crazy, and that can happen. Imagine being in a crowded restaurant. First of all, imagine being in a crowded restaurant today with the pandemic. But imagine being in that, and all those people are talking, and you cannot focus your attention on any one person. It's all coming at you at once. And imagine if that was all coming from their minds instead of verbally. And there are some people that actually have this problem. We often call that a psychic opening. Montague Ullman, who I mentioned earlier on, was one of the researchers on dream telepathy. He also was a psychiatrist, and he worked with schizophrenics, and he found that some of them who were hearing voices and scaring the staff because the stuff that they were hearing in their heads, they'd say it out loud, and it was something the staff member was thinking as opposed to saying.
That is absolutely amazing.
Yeah,
absolutely amazing.
What he found was he gave them some techniques, no drugs, took them off drugs, gave them some techniques to block. There are some visualizations you can learn to block that stuff pretty easily, and they were released. They weren't schizophrenic anymore. So there's an issue around mental health about how much is truly psychological and how much is a reaction to something psychic or some other external thing that's there. We have to kind of look at all that stuff. But one thing we do know is that nobody can do what people can do in science fiction, which is really do a deep mind probe. No mind melding, at least nobody we found so far.
It's a good thing. My wife would do it to me every day.
Well, that's the thing is that that's one of the reasons why we have our blocks up automatically. We don't want everybody to know everything about us, and that's a scary thing. I mean, that's probably more scary than almost anything else. I've actually, again, talked to a couple of the pseudo-skeptics, one of whom actually said to me, as we were talking about the research, and he said ESP research is false, it's not real. He hadn't even looked at the research, of course. And I said, well, what's the problem with at least acknowledging there's something here? He said, well, if ESP was real, I think I'd have to kill myself. And it turned out he assumed stupidly, it's a stupid assumption, that if suddenly science says this is something worth studying and ESP is real in some cases, that suddenly everybody in the world suddenly turns psychic, and that we could read each other's minds and deepest thoughts. And he was afraid of his deep, I actually said to him, so what is it in your deepest, darkest thoughts that you're so scared of that would make you don't want other people to know?
Wow. Thank you for answering that question.
Yeah.
Well, what's the mechanism? What do you think give an idea?
There's a lot of different ideas about this. The one thing we know it's not electromagnetic the way we think of it. Originally telepathy and all psychic phenomena was considered like mental radio. In fact, there's an old book called Mental Radio. Partly, I think, because from what we've looked at societally at the time that researchers started doing work on telepathy and other things, the Society for Psychical Research, for example, in the 1880s, that radio was just an idea that was kind of wireless communication was just happening. So it was a good metaphor to have a sender and receiver, because you'd have a sender for a radio set and a receiver for a radio set. But there's no mechanism that has been found within the brain that actually allows us to do that. And also we know that remote viewing works, that telepathy experiments work if a person's in a Faraday cage, where one person's which blocks all electromagnetic fields, with the one exception being the Earth's magnetic field. So that may be involved in some way, shape, or form, but it's not radio. So it's not along that way. We don't know what the actual mechanism is. We're looking at folks in our field and outside our field are looking at possible communication or information transfer via quantum level. But even then, if it's quantum, if it's entanglement or something like that, then how does that information go from our the gross world, the big world, down to the
boson particle?
Yeah, how does it get down there? And then how does it get back up? How do we even acknowledge that? And the only possibility so far is that consciousness itself is more than just the brain. That there's something.
I believe that.
Yeah, we do too. There's more to consciousness, that it's not localized necessarily in the brain. It may be created by the brain, but it's not local necessarily. And so there's much more, there's a different way that we have to start looking at information transfer than just simply leaving it as a materialistic perspective.
Energy cannot be destroyed.
It
transforms, but it can't be destroyed.
But we also don't know that this is energetic. We don't know, because people have talked about quantum particles versus energy, the way we think of it. And there's even, there's physicists who talk about the smallest thing below the quantum level is information. The universe's building blocks are information, whatever the hell that means.
Right. Cool. Ghosts, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences. Let's look at that. Let's dive right into it.
Let's start from out of body, because with out of body experiences, we're still in the body more or less most of the time.
Correct. That makes sense.
Yeah. So out of body experiences seem to be different than remote viewing in the way that watching a football game from the stadium is different than watching it on TV. Watching it on TV is remote viewing. Being there is out of body experience. So what's happening is that when you have an out-of-body experience, it seems that part of your consciousness may split off. That's what one of the research participants, who was extremely good at out-of-body experience, he said, it's part of me that's splitting off, and the information is it's like a space probe, and it's going out there, and it can be in the form of you. You can be seen sometimes. That's some really interesting out-of-body experientes.
That sounds like that video game Quantum Dream. I can't remember the name of it. It's where this girl is. It was on PlayStation. No, it's on PC now. But it's like you're this girl, and she has these profound abilities like that. And she goes into this embassy in some Middle Eastern country to steal some information. And she sits on the commode, like in this place, and then she leaves her body, like. But she can still kind of talk and move and kind of move around a little bit. Is that kind of where you're going about with this?
Yeah, and that some people who do out of body experience on a regular basis, who are able to control it, are capable of just talking through from their own bodies. Alex Tanis, who we did research with at the ASPR way back when, basically was narrating what his out of body counterpart Alex 2 was doing. which was part of the experiment. And others I've talked to were able to do the same sort of thing. So whether or not we split off part of our consciousness, Alex was pretty certain, and everybody else I ever talked to who did out of body, positive that our spirits don't leave our bodies. I mean, Alex would say, if my spirit left my body, I'd be dead. But a part of his consciousness would split off, and on occasion he would be seen in that other location. That's often called bilocation. So we had those kinds of things. Now that suggests, all of that supports the idea that at least part of us can leave the body. Out-of-body experiences are not uncommon in near-death experiences. They're not completely common, but they do happen in a number of them. People have that tunnel effect. They see the tunnel and the light. That's actually not consistent across the world. There are different parts of the world, different cultures where people actually have a bridge, a river or a stream that they're going over instead.
We had Howard Storm on our program. You know Howard Storm? Are you familiar with him at least?
No.
Check it out. Check out one of my earlier episodes. It's my second episode I ever made. It is one of the most gripping and remarkable near-death experiences I've ever heard of.
Yeah, there's a number of different constituents, or I guess say almost symptoms of a true near-death experience. And some people experience only some of them. Rarely does anybody ever get all 15. But there are, with the out-of-body experience, and some of them, there have been really good examples of people not only hovering above their bodies and being able to later on describe exactly what was going on, but even going to another location in the hospital and describing what's in the next operating theater or someplace else in the hospital, which is not possible under any circumstance. And it suggests, again, it supports the idea that consciousness survives the death of the body, or can at least split off at some point. And then we get into the apparition or the ghost piece. And what we're dealing with there are cases where people, and the majority of ghost sightings or encounters are people that you know who have died and are appearing to you, or in some way letting you know that they're there. They're not always visual at the moment of death, or sometime up to usually about 2 or 3 days, sometimes a little bit longer, but there's this kind of like coming to say goodbye kind of thing that we see. And that's the majority of them. But then you have the few that stick around, and some psychics have like the definitive, this is why they're here, like it fits everybody. There is no one size fits all. What we've heard from various cases over the 140 years is when there is communication with the witnesses, or when psychics or mediums are brought in, sometimes they're in denial that they're dead. I doubt that they actually don't know that they're dead. I think that they're in denial. Sometimes they're afraid of what's next, so they stick around. Sometimes they're too comfortable or too possessive of their property or family. A lot of apparitions say that they're sticking around for their family because the family won't let them go, won't grieve properly, so they want to make sure they're going to be okay. And people see, hear, feel, smell, pretty much everything but taste apparitions. And sometimes there can be multiple sightings by multiple people. But what's really interesting is that in many cases where you have more than one witness, not everybody experiences the apparition the same way. You might have 15 people in a room, there's a ghost there, 3 people see the apparition and hear that ghost talking. 2 people hear the ghost talking but don't see the apparition. 1 person sees the apparition but doesn't get any verbal or anything else. Somebody else smells a cologne or perfume or body odor associated with that person, and several other people feel a presence, and then there's a bunch of people that get nothing. They're like, oh, you guys are crazy.
Have you seen an apparition yourself?
I have not seen an apparition, but I have heard, felt, and smelled.
I had my very first apparition sighting several months ago around 3 o'clock in the morning on my way home from work. Remarkable. I live next to Lake Sidney Lanier in North Georgia, and it's considered by many the most haunted and dangerous lake in the entire world. Actually, we've done some podcasts about it. There's an area here that I've coined the Coal Mountain Triangle, and it's just one of those triangle areas where a lot of different crazy phenomenon happens, all that seem to be in and around a triangular shaped area. But I had my first ghost sighting not far, right in front of my house on the highway. Very, very remarkable.
Yeah, it's a lot more common. I've had people who in a group would say that they've never had any sort of experience and maybe even say they don't believe it. And then they pull you aside later on or pull me aside later on and start telling me their ghost story.
Yeah.
And it's pretty common. Actually.
Sounds like my mother. Sounds just like my mother.
Like everybody, it's really interesting because I've been involved with a real job, like a supportive job that I've needed. I've been in and around law firm professionals, lawyers and other people and people in business. And it's really interesting talking to them separately. And then when they're in the group, just like, they've never told anybody their experience until they find out who I am. And then they tell me their experience. And I always ask them, have you ever told anybody this? Like, no. It's like, I just talked to your wife because she's here at the same party. You know that she had a ghost experience too. And she's not told. It's like, you guys aren't, if people would just simply stop worrying about being thought of as weird, we would find that a majority of the population has had some kind of, whether it's ghostly or ESP experience, people have had these experiences. There's nothing paranormal about them. They're normal experiences.
Well, I think this is a good point for Q&A, a hearty Q&A session. I may say. Then let's get into. I'd like to get into your courses and your teaching stuff right after that, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Vince, would you kick off a Q&A?
Yeah, I had a question. You were talking earlier about, we were talking about the mechanisms behind a lot of things in parapsychology. I was reading a book recently about a subject that actually I had previously in quantum biology, and it basically the premise is that it a lot of things that have to do with life and our biomechanisms happen on the quantum level in a way that we can't understand yet. Has anybody within the field ever maybe correlated the two, or maybe thought about bringing up studies in order to see if that might be something that is the mechanism for all of these things?
Well, I know that people in our field are talking to physicists, and actually quantum physicists are the most open of all the sciences to talking to us, because they're also interested in consciousness and how consciousness may affect the quantum level, how our consciousness might. There are experiments in our field which look the double slit, kind of classic physics experiment, the double slit experiment, where it seems that intention does affect things at the quantum level. So there's definitely, it's not as great a connection as we would like. And of course, part of the problem is we don't have funding in our field to speak of. There's only one major funding organization, and it's limited in what they can actually provide. So we would love for people in other fields to be open enough to talk to us, but then there's this academic bias against the field. If you admit to, in some places in academia, in certain universities, if you admit to even an interest in this subject, unless you have tenure, but you might lose your job.
But I find that strange because quantum mechanics is now seen as a bona fide science, but it's so weird. It's so weird. Like the stuff with it is so weird. I don't see why, I understand why they have to have an open mind because the stuff is out there.
Yeah, and I think, again, there was a survey done by Dean Radin years ago of people in various sciences and finding that quantum physicists were the most open to the idea of psychic phenomena. I don't know about ghosts, but certainly other things, because they're interested in consciousness. And really, when it comes right down to it, you're asking about the mechanism. The mechanism is related to consciousness, and we don't know the mechanism for consciousness.
Right.
I'm asked all the time when I do speeches, talks, especially, somebody say, where's your proof for ghosts? It's like, where's the proof for consciousness? If a ghost is a consciousness without a body, how do we study that if we don't know what consciousness is in the body?
Good point. Excellent point.
It's the consciousness problem, and it's a big debate in science. I mean, in all fields of science, the definition of consciousness, and there's the materialist view, there's the dualist view. It's a philosophical issue, it's a neurological issue, it's a physics issue, it's a biology issue, it's an issue across the boards. And fortunately, there are people who are focused on that question, but there's not a lot of them yet, not enough of them. And parapsychology is a form of consciousness studies, because we're studying a particular set of experiences and phenomena that relate directly to consciousness, maybe with the brain, maybe not with the brain.
I think the brain
Yeah.
might be like a neural processor for your consciousness.
I have no problem with the brain creating consciousness, as we gain experience and such. I'm on the side of survival of consciousness after that. There's a whole range of folks who believe that our brains are actually the receivers of consciousness, that the signal's out here, kind of like a satellite signal or your cable signal. So basically, one of the arguments about consciousness being, having to be in the brain, that the more materialist folks will bring up is that, well, when there's brain damage, the person can't communicate, they can't do X, Y, and Z. It's like, well, when your TV set has a problem, does that mean the signal's not good anymore? The cable signal's still coming in, strong. It's just your TV is the interface, and the interface has a problem, not the signal. So if consciousness is outside the body, coming into the brain, yes, if there's a problem with the brain or the body, that's the interface. There's going to be a problem with communicating or seeing signs of consciousness the way we think of it. But it doesn't mean the consciousness isn't there.
Wow. I wish Greg was here for all this, Vince. My other partner, Greg, we have another. He's our historical advisor and co-host. He wasn't able to be here with us, but he definitely wanted to be, and I really hate that he wasn't able to be here. Vince, did you have any more questions?
No, all my questions were answered.
Man, those were good questions, and thank you for that, my friend. Jake, you're up.
Yeah, so this is really my field of very novice research, and I have experienced while doing paranormal investigations with multiple people the phenomenon of all of us experiencing something, but all of us experiencing something different at the time. What if we could delve a little deeper into that and to what you think?
Good question, man. Good question.
Yeah, but so one thing I want you to think of is imagine yourself as, let's go Star Trek here, a ball of energy, an energetic being with no body. And the only way that you can communicate is to send out a signal. In fact, you can send out a signal, broadcast something that includes an image of how you think of yourself with a body, of what you sound like, what you feel like, what you smell like, all of that. So what we have is each person is receiving that signal, but we're receiving that signal and processing it differently. Our perceptions are everybody's perceptions are slightly different. There are certain commonalities, but when the common New Age thing, we create our own reality. We perceive our own reality, actually. How I'm seeing the world may not be the same the way that you're seeing the world. And it's about getting that signal, and different parts of that signal for me personally may be processed auditorily, physically, visually, as opposed to some other way.
It's kind of, in a weird way, it's kind of like relativity.
It's relative to our own personal experience. But the thing that's really interesting is that when people have reported apparitions and they're visual and they're people that they knew, they're often surprised at the fact that the person they're seeing looks like he or she did when they were 30, but they died at 85 or 90, or they died of some traumatic injury, and unlike the movie The Sixth Sense, they look pretty healthy. Or that they're wearing different clothing when they appear to people, the same person, over and over again. And if and I've done this. I used to do college lectures on a really regular basis until the economy tanked in the 2000s, and also the ghost hunters on TV seemed to get all the gigs. But when I had sometimes really large audiences at some colleges and sometimes really small ones. I think I had the largest was over 3,000. The smallest was probably 8 people, just because there was a basketball final happen at that college. So I would ask them, after talking about this, I would ask everybody to close their eyes and to picture themselves. And first of all, people do not picture themselves naked, with rare exception. So it's really interesting that you almost never have a report of a naked ghost in our culture, because that's not how people see themselves.
It's rare.
Yeah. And the other thing is that we look in our own mind's eye, we all look different than we might actually. I'm younger in my mind's eye. I mean, I'm much younger. My beard is darker. I see myself as back
Your
in.
beard looks good, brother, man. It looks
Thank you.
really.
I appreciate
I'm a beard. Mine looks like crap, man. Look at this garbage, man.
I've had this beard. I haven't seen my upper lip since 1970. There are times that I didn't have a beard, but I've had this beard since 1986. So
you got the Tom Cruise of beards, man.
Yeah. So, I picture myself a little differently, a little less weight, certain other ways. And that seems to be our self-image. And that's what how people pick us up. So, but people process in our perceptual process. We get the signal, just like we're getting signals from our eyes and our ears, and the perceptions in our head process that, and then add that picture, add that sound, add that smell to the regular perceptions we're getting. So it's all about that. Now, interestingly enough, when I've done these surveys, a lot of ghosts are seen only down to about their knees, right above or right below their knees, which is interesting. And so I started asking these college students, when they pictured themselves, how many of you picture yourselves all the way down to your feet? In your self-image, did you see your shoes? And only about 5% said yes. And then I had them keep their hands up, especially in the large audiences. And then I would ask, how many of you that have your hands up buy a lot of shoes? And I would say that 4 out of 5 bought a lot of shoes, which is why they were thinking themselves all the way down to their feet. Shoes were an important part of their self-image. Not so much for a lot of people.
Wow. Good question. Jake, you got anything else? You got any more questions for us? Give us something. Give us something.
So,
and did that clear it up for you?
Yeah, yes, it did clear it up for me. And I do have a follow-up to that. Do you think that it could also possibly be that their perception is open to different things, like in a certain way? I'm an audio guy, I'm an audio engineer, so I tend to experience a lot of auditory incidents out in the field, versus my other friends who feel more tactile sensations or perhaps see something more.
I think that's
so. Could it be?
Yeah, we've talked in psychology. They often talk about people being more kinesthetic, or visual, or auditory in the way that they deal with the world. You could even tell sometimes when people say, I hear what you're saying, I feel you, man, I can see what you're saying. Those almost are always giveaways for the way the person processes too.
Sure. Very interesting.
Wow. Good questions, brother. Good questions. Thank you for those questions. I actually have a question. So let's look at this. Let's go back to clairvoyance for just a minute. So time, time space. Is it a cosmic hard drive? Are we just simply in a psychic way when we're remote viewing or whatever, or looking at Xener cards? Either way, are we accessing data from the cosmic hard drive?
You mean the cosmic cloud?
Yes. Yeah. I'm behind the times.
We're talking about the cloud here. We're not talking about hard drives anymore. It's in some instances, certainly we are picking up information that's kind of like imprinted in the world. When we have hauntings, what ghost hunters call often residual hauntings, it seems like we're picking up information that's imprinted into the environment. And whether that is out there or right here is hard to say. It's not always easy to tell what the source of the information is. In fact, in the early ESP research with cards, J.B. Rhine decided that he really couldn't say it was a telepathy experiment when somebody's looking at a card and somebody else is saying what the card is, because you never knew if the information is coming from the card, which would be clairvoyance, or from the mind of the person looking at the card, which would be telepathy. There's no way to separate those two things out. With precognition, one of the things that we're dealing with today is a model of a lot of psychic information being actually precognitive. In fact, when Joe McMoneagle does really well at precognitive remote viewing, like viewing someplace that's going to randomly be selected after he's done the viewing, if he's going to be taken to that location versus one that's just going to be chosen. He does better when he's going to be taken there. And Ed May and a couple of others have felt that what's going on is that he's not viewing the location, he's connecting with his future self and picking up the feedback of being in that location.
I've never looked at it that way. I've always thought it had something to do with the fourth dimension.
Yeah, time, there's a couple of really interesting things about time. And when we start getting into a discussion of time, there's not, there are physicists who believe that time is a psychological construct that doesn't exist at all. And then there are others that believe in simultaneous time, and others that believe that the future is, like most of us, the future is not set in stone. There's all sorts of variations, both in philosophy and in physics. It's been a long time, but I taught a course in the physics and philosophy of time. And the one thing we do know is that time changes. In other words, the flow of time changes. The speed at which time changes has been verified. That's part of relativity theory. It's one of the parts of relativity theory that's been proven that if you're going faster than the rest of the world, like in a Mach 3 jet.
Interstellar.
Yeah, there's all that, time dilation in space, but it's been proven here on Earth, both velocity and also gravity. Apparently, time does not pass at the same exact rate at the top of Mount Kilimanjaro, which is the furthest point from the center of the Earth, than it does on the surface at sea level. Now, we can't perceive that difference because it's minimal. I mean, atomic clocks can perceive that, but we can't. But time does change, so there's that piece of it. And then there's the issue of whether the future is already existing or if it's just a cloud of possibilities, potential, which is what most of the better psychics will say. Kind of like the weather report, you think that a physical science should be able to predict the weather accurately, but they can't because the weather there's so many unforeseen circumstances or
there's so many models.
Different models, and even the one model that seems to be working really well, the further out you try to predict, the more things that you can't account for because you don't know about them.
I'm an amateur storm spotter, by the way.
Cool.
I'm certified. I'm just not registered yet. I haven't had a chance to get registered.
Well, here's an interesting thing. Meteorologists can predict the weather closer in time to the prediction. They're going to be more accurate, right? Mm-hmm. Same thing with precognition. Precognition works the less time between the prediction and the event, the more likely it is to be accurate.
You don't say. Just okay. So let's go back to out-of-body experiences for a minute. Here's my second question. So I was listening to all of Art Bell's. I'm doing some research now into demonology, and one thing that I've had some experiences along those lines as well, by the way, that I believe could very possibly be something like that. But I was listening to his interviews with Father Malachi Martin, and I was so fascinated by his interviews. I listened to I think all 7 or 8 of them, but I remember in one interview he was talking about remote viewing. And him and somebody that claimed to be involved with either Project Stargate or the program, whatever itineration it was before Project Stargate, that they called this whenever their consciousness sometimes they would have out-of-body experiences during the course of some of these experiments, and they called this this dimension the plateau. Number one, are you familiar with that term? The plateau, and number 2, do you think it could be what they call, what the Catholics would call like a purgatory-like place? And the last question I want to add, the part of this question is, do you think it really exists? And what's the purpose? Is it just like in the fourth dimension? Are we talking about like an actual dimension of time that the soul or the consciousness is in? I know that's a real complex question, but I'll let you answer that.
Well, first, let me say that when mediums are talking to people on the so-called other side, when people have left the earth plane, as they often talk about, we don't know what that existence actually is. We don't know if it's another dimension. We don't know if it's just simply a different way of existing. Certainly, they don't have bodies anymore. Physicists have described that there are 11 to 27 different dimensions, depending on who you talk to. And when it comes right down to it, we don't know what that means. We perceive in 3 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension, essentially duration, but it's not. We don't know whether our perceptions can bleed into other dimensions the way we think of it, and whether those dimensions are just simply here with us and just different ways of existing in space and time. So that's one thing. So people talk about the astral plane. They talk about. I've only heard the word plateau once or twice. It's usually talked about as the astral plane. Ingo Swann, who was the person who actually taught most of the initial remote viewers, did both remote viewing and out-of-body work. And Swann was an amazing he was a subject in a lot of out-of-body experiments. His book, To Kiss Earth Goodbye, which came out in 1976, he talked about traveling out of body to Jupiter and Saturn. And
Wow.
The things he described around Jupiter and Saturn were contradictory to what we knew about Jupiter and Saturn until Voyager got there. Once Voyager confirmed some of the odd things that he said he had observed, like Saturn's rings being great and rings around Jupiter. There's some things he talked about that, and he considered that out of body, not remote viewing, because he felt like he went there, which is that's a big differentiator right there. As far as the religious perspective, it is a religious perspective. There is nothing we talk about in parapsychology other than studying it from an anthropological perspective.
Right.
I personally do not believe in demonic anything. I think there could be some harmful or dangerous forces, so to speak. But I've had cases where people have claimed it was demonic, and it was not even close to bad. It was just that they were freaked out because they watched too many TV shows. Or they blamed everything that they, I've had people blaming, they saw an apparition and all of a sudden they trip and fall and hurt themselves. The demon, the apparition pushed them, right. Or the demonic entity. Or then you have the ghost hunters who get the growl or something like that on EVP when there's nothing bad reported at all. And suddenly they tell people there's a demon there. There's a lot of misinterpretation. There's a lot of bad folklore that's being applied. There's an awful lot. We have no evidence of demonic entities within our field that we've seen at all. Harmful, potentially. There are certainly some a-holes who apparently are sticking around as ghosts, or bullies, people who are bullies, and you could call them demonic in that sense, but you'd have to call the living people demonic then, before they die, wouldn't you? There has to be that kind of parity there. We don't hear anything about heaven per se or hell the way that it's normally talked about in various books or religious perspectives, and there are various interpretations of the afterlife going back thousands of years that have some commonalities, but not the commonalities that you find in other ways.
I have a theory about that, by the way. What if, the one thing I've learned about, and my uncle had a near-death experience, and he told me about when I was about 8 years old, and it blew me away. I saw that first segment on Unsolved Mysteries around the same time about the little girl, and she was flying through a tunnel, a real pretty colored tunnel, and she met this woman, and she met the light of God. She encountered the light of God, and it was just it blew me away, yeah. Man. But here's my theory. Everybody, almost every person who reports a near-death experience, there are several common factors that I've noticed. One of them, as you previously mentioned, being out of the body and observing. What I think what I kind of suspect is happening, I think that what's happening possibly is when people have these experiences, they might not recall all of the experience. They might not be able to remember all of it. But I think what happens is it's literally traveling across dimensions. I think what could be, because everybody reports something very similar, but if there also very different at the same time. As far as what they experience, and they all seem to say that everything kind of happens at once. It's like time doesn't exist,
Right.
or you perceive time in a different way, I guess. You, but what I think is happening is you're going through all these dimensions, and I think that maybe you're going through the fourth dimension once you leave our universe. Maybe you're going into the fourth dimension. Maybe you're seeing your life review there. Maybe that's what's happening. Maybe then one account I read that would just blew my mind. This woman, she said she was. She didn't believe in anything, no afterlife, no nothing, no higher power, no other types of entities or anything. But when she had her near-death experience, she reported that she left her body, she flew through the universe, like literally just took off. And then once she got through the universe, she saw those three dimensions collapse. It's like it was like it was collapsing. And then she's in this other dimension, and then she's seeing her life review, and then that dimension, it just kind of collapses, and so on and so forth. Do you think that they're just traveling across many different dimensions?
It's really impossible for us to determine that. When I work because I'm president of an organization called the Forever Family Foundation, and we certify with a scientific protocol mediums who are evidential. And talking to those mediums, as well as other mediums and psychics I've worked with over the years, they talk about the afterlife. People always love to ask in that group sessions, what's the afterlife like? And the mediums generally will say, here's what they're describing to me, but just realize that it's filtered through my brain and what I know. So there's a bias. In other words, it's interpreted by me. Whatever information they're giving, and I can't possibly interpret things that are outside my experience. So I tend to think that the afterlife is more different than we can even imagine. This thing going into the science fiction realm, it's not only different than we think, it's more different than we can imagine at this point, because we don't have the experience of what that is. Kind of like a fish trying to describe describe space. How do you describe empty space when you're living in a watery environment? Right. You exactly. don't have any. You don't have any words. You don't have anything. Many of the people who have a near-death experience remember having like a moment of knowing everything, but they don't remember it anymore. And there's a lot of interpretation. We think that, like with the mediums, that whatever that experience was, it is being interpreted based on what's in their heads already, their memories, their experiences, their beliefs. Good example is that one study of Christians having near-death experiences. And Hindus in India, the Christians often saw Jesus, a light speaking to them, light of God, a saint if they were Catholic. Hindus saw Hindu gods.
Yeah, exactly. It's fascinating.
So the figure is based on you. And then there are negative near-death experiences.
Yes.
But the negative ones, which are a very, very small percentage, tend to be people who grew up in a fire and brimstone religion, where it's likely that their bias is that I am not worthy, which is why I'm being punished when I get there.
That was Howard Storm's experience initially. My friend Howard Storm, he was on Unsolved Mysteries kind of in the towards the later seasons before Robert Stack died. It was unbelievable, man. I'm telling you, it changed his life in dramatic ways.
One of the interesting things about near-death experiences, the really good near-death experiences, the ones that really seem to fall into our field, is that there is often a shift. There's certainly a shift in perspective about death for most people. Not for everybody, but for most people. And there's even sometimes a shift in what they're interested in and how and where they need to go next and what the next thing they need to do in life is. And that actually has caused marriages to collapse.
And psychic abilities too.
And psychic abilities to manifest. That's right. Because they believe it now.
Wow. Let's talk about your teaching. Can we?
Yeah. So I've been teaching for years through the Rhine Education Center. That's part of the Rhine Research Center.
I'm a member, by the way.
Excuse me?
I'm a member, by the way.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that. We hope that more people become members of the Rhine Center. You get access, as you know, you get access to this huge media library of all the lectures that we've been recording over the years.
What's the website for that for our listeners?
Yeah, for the Rhine Center, it's Rhine. It's RHINE.org. That's the main website. You can go directly to the education website. That's rhineedu.org. Or just go to rhine.org and click on the education link, and that'll take you over to our courses. So right now we've started courses already. I'm teaching 2 courses right now. One is on parapsychology and anthropology, looking at cross-culturally at how people experience what we call psychic abilities and what anthropologists have done with it, and how we can pull stuff out of that, some really cool stuff. And then I'm teaching a first-level basic field investigations class. Think of it as Ghost Hunting 101. We actually have some more research-oriented courses that John Kruth teaches. We've now brought in some other instructors. We're expanding quite a bit. And we have several certificate programs. So these are, I have to say, they're semi-academic.
They are. I'm going to take all of them. I've already, as soon as I can get the funding to do it, I'm going to take all of those courses, man. I've already decided I'm going to take.
Well, we're hoping people do. We try not to price them too much. They're typically either 4-week or 8-week classes. They're usually around 200 for the longer classes, like $250. But the whole idea here is that some people can take them for a grade, or you can just join in for fun. I mean, you can just take them for fun. And the ones who take them for a grade, if they pass the class, and I've had only one person over the years not pass the class, and that was because they didn't do the assignments, not because they got it wrong. Because frankly, anything online is open book, more or less. It actually bothers me when somebody doesn't get the right answer when they have the slides from the lecture, and the answer is on the slides. That bugs me as an instructor. That shows laziness, essentially.
I should have named one of my children after you, brother.
So the courses, I've taught courses in, so we have multiple courses in investigations, including one on using technology. We have an advanced ghost hunting, advanced investigations class.
That's awesome.
I've taught courses. Personally, I've teach courses kind of in my wheelhouse, which is more experiential, talking about, I've got a 4-week class in August called Developing Intuition, which is really developing ESP, based on what I've learned from not only the research in the laboratory, but also working with a lot of psychics and mediums over the years, how to develop and how to work with your own psychic abilities. I've taught courses in a variety of areas, and if you look at the Rhine Education site, you can see that there's a link to see what all the classes are we've offered. I even offered a class last fall with a skeptic named Kenny Biddle, and we did a course on the skeptical approach to parapsychology.
Wow.
And Kenny was it was a fun class for both of us.
I've watched some of those videos, by the way. I watched one on remote viewing. That was really good, man.
Probably
good videos.
And Paul's, I think, teaching the remote viewing class in August as well. So that'll be a 4-week class. So we have experiential classes, and we have research classes, and we have more general classes. I've taught a course on pop culture and parapsychology, which is basically comic books, movies, and TV, and then also reality TV falls into that too. And
cool.
I just taught a course called Presenting the Paranormal to the Public for people who do investigations or who want to talk to the public about the subject. Had a few people who do podcasts, and then I'm going to turn that into a book, in fact.
That's cool. You've written books. How many
I've written
books have you written?
I was going to mention my Mind Over Matter book, which is all about PK and covers martial arts and all the stuff we were talking about, but it just went out of print. There still are physical copies at Amazon, I believe. I don't believe that they pulled them all back because it only went out of print a month ago. And I'm actually going to bring it back into print hopefully by September. So you'll find it then. It's just simply called Mind Over Matter. Plenty of used copies around for that. Just the ebook right now is not available anymore because the publisher took it down. And I've written ESP Wars East and West, which is that book. Main author is Edwin C. May, who was the program director of Stargate for 11 years. Joe McMoneagle, the #1 viewer, is part of that. It goes into the history of the program, the Stargate program, what it was called before Stargate, how it started, how it ended, and why it hasn't been resurrected. But also there's contributions from the Russians. Ed and Joe got to know some of our Russian counterparts in the early 90s. And there's some cool stuff about the KGB in there, too, by the way. In fact,
wow. I'm man.
Our foreword is by Nikolai Sham, who was the deputy director of the KGB when the wall fell. So it's the only book on the remote viewing program that actually covers both sides, U.S. and Soviets. And then I've written books. My psychic dreaming book is still available. And I've got books like The Ghost Detective's Guide to Haunted San Francisco, which was co-authored by a medium by the name of Annette Martin. And it's really a way of finding out how parapsychologists and mediums work together on cases. That's kind of what that's about. And then there's a couple of basic books. I wrote a book called Ghost Hunting and Hauntings and Poltergeists, and those are really very entry level. They're written differently than my other books as well. And my ESP Hauntings and Poltergeists, my first book, is available still.
Cool. That's awesome. What about documentaries? Is there any documentaries there that you've been in that you really enjoy that you would recommend for us to look at?
Trying to think of there's a series on Netflix called Surviving Death. I'm involved in.
I've seen it. Episode
5, and I wrote a chapter for the book that's based on, called Surviving Death by Leslie Kean. There is another book. There's a documentary on Amazon. I think it's called Surviving Death. Also, it was done years ago. It's a half-hour documentary that I'm involved in. One of the favorite things I was involved in was kind of a goofy one. It's a look at ghost hunting. It's called Ghostumentary. And it's on Amazon Prime.
I think I've seen that. I think I've heard of that actually.
It was a fun thing. It was a real fun thing. Unfortunately, they couldn't get licensed to use the Star Wars references that they wanted because they had some like me and Yoda just juxtaposed at the end. And
I want your autograph, bro. I want it, man.
I have a YouTube channel and it has a lot of segments of TV stuff that I've done. It's just simply youtube.com/Loyd.
You were on Sightings, weren't you?
I did a lot with Sightings, especially the first few years. In fact,
I remember it. I remember seeing you when I was a kid.
The Sightings Ghost Report you can find on YouTube. The Sightings Psychic Powers Report you can find on YouTube as well. Some of my segments from Sightings are up on my YouTube channel. And I have another YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Prof Paranormal, as in Professor Paranormal. And that has a couple of my lectures, including a relatively recent lecture on psychic dreaming that's there.
That is so awesome, man. This has been awesome, man. This has been one of the best interviews we've done, hands down, man. I want to give a final thought for Jake and Vince, if you and you. Let's start with Jake, and we'll go to Vince, and then we'll leave it with you, my friend.
So, this is very interesting. I've been taking notes and, coming up with all sorts of highlighted points that I'm going to be researching. So I just want to say thank you for joining us tonight. It's been very insightful and, has kind of opened up another door for me. So I'm going to look into several of your books that I see here on my screen, and hopefully we'll be able to talk again soon.
Sure.
Yeah, we need to do something else one day. Vince?
Yeah, I'm going to echo talking. I went on Amazon because I basically live on Amazon, and I've put your Mind Over Matter book into my inbox. So I'm definitely gonna read that. I think that you've I didn't really know that much about parapsychology. I guess on a layman's term, in a layman's way, I knew about it. But you really enlightened me today. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah. I tell you what, man. If you could leave us with one thought, what would it be for what parapsychology means for mankind today and moving forward? What's your thoughts?
So parapsychology, this is what has kept me interested all along. Parapsychology, what we're studying, psychic phenomena in general, says a lot about what it means to be human and extends the limits that the mainstream puts on us of being human beings, extends that to our connections with each other and our connections with the physical world and beyond and after death. It has an enormous amount of impact of what to say about who we are as human beings. And that question, what is our potential? Who are we as humans? That's what's kept me interested. That's a question that you see on Star Trek. It's a question you see in a lot of science fiction. it is a mystery. You know, what are these things? How are they working? Why do they work? That's the mystery. But what it says is we're much more than we think we are.
I amen to that, man. I believe it 100%. I believe that there is this mystery, and here on this we're a research group. What we're doing right here is we are researching, and we're sharing this research with the public. And the way I see it, whether you agree or disagree with someone's conclusions, you should always listen to understand them. And you never know what you're going to learn. I mean, there are some bright minds that have different perspectives in these fields that are related to this. And I just find the fellowship great. It's just you meet some of the best minds out there, and you're definitely part of the gang here, man. We appreciate you being with us. Maybe one day down the road, if you'd be interested, maybe we could do like a round table or something. Maybe we can have Dr. Taft. Maybe,
oh, yeah.
I'm sure Dr. Taft. I'm sure he'd be happy to come back. He told me he would.
Yeah, I'll do anything with Barry. Barry's a good guy. Yeah,
he is a great guy, man. I think the world of him. I read it. His book is really good. Aliens Above, Ghosts Below. Great book. But let's hang out again sometime. Let's
sure.
have another conversation.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. You're listening to Parapsychology 101 with our special guest Loyd Auerbach, and this is Project Stargate Friends Research. We'll see you next time.